In no time flat, the MCU went from the biggest entertainment franchise the world had ever seen to near universal rejection from audiences of both genders across all nations and cultures worldwide. You can bet that despite opening at number 1 on Disney Plus and Hulu, when the actual viewing numbers for Marvel's Echo are in, they will be pitiful, even if the series checks so many boxes and is so diverse, equitable, and inclusive that according to recent Hollywood logic, everyone should flock to it. Alas, that is just it. Recent Hollywood logic is entirely illogical, and that is something more and more in Hollywood are starting to notice. Chris Gore and Alan Ng of Film Threat fame have recently begun documenting the inside word on the downfall of Disney and all its entertainment divisions, which we have duly covered here as well. But the rot that took down Disney, the toxic and destructive quasi-religious ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion, extends well beyond Disney. The Film Threat guys recently were contacted by a Hollywood screenwriter with 20 years of experience. This writer's identity is known to them, but it remains undisclosed to the public, as lone whistleblowers tend not to be rewarded for telling the truth. This screenwriter then wrote an anonymous open letter that was published on Film Threat, which details when this writer discovered that something changed in Hollywood, and how that change manifested itself in not just the opportunities available for highly skilled and experienced writers, but subsequently in the entertainment that made its way to all our screens. Let's dive in and explore some highlights. This whistleblower begins with establishing that before, the focus was on ideas, characters, and plotting compelling narrative arcs, as everyone understood who the audience were and had enough of a business understanding to know that the audience must be entertained. But then, in 2019, things started to change, and quickly. Suddenly, subtext and themes became the main point of discussing a project or IP. The first question in every meeting became, what can we say with this project, or what can we teach people with this story? Plot, character, and audience were now secondary, and sometimes not even discussed. This, of course, is when everything became about ideopolitical posturing and messaging, and identity. For the most current case in point, look no further than Marvel's Echo. Even the positive reviews don't say anything about the story or character development, because there's nothing good to say about it. The only thing they can praise it for is for the Native American representation, and that the lead actress is not only a woman and a person of color, but also deaf, and on top of that, an amputee. That's a lot of D.E.I. brownie points right there. With so much inclusion, who needs a story? Certainly not the new batch of executives who greenlights this kind of stuff. And on that note, this writer continues. These new executives weren't savvy and business-minded executives. They were young, with no track record or comprehension of the bottom line. When the streaming war started and the money hose was turned on, those experienced executives started relying on these young guns to pick up the slack. But the kids were less focused on the hero's journey and more concerned with taking down the patriarchy. Here I'd like to add that while this happened across the board, Disney was the worst offender, and Bob Iger revealed why in his memoirs/management handbook, a book that has aged very poorly indeed. In it, he describes how he was going all in on Disney Plus and encouraged all his staffers to spare no expense to that end. In fact, he created a new incentive structure not tied to the box office to ensure that they would go all out and spend money like drunken sailors. But let's continue. The reality is that for the past 5 years, white, straight, male writers and directors with experience and successful track records have been sidelined. We talk about it over coffee and after screenings. We've essentially been told that because of our race and gender, we need not apply. At one point, my agent told me that they couldn't put me up for any open writing assignments or TV staffing jobs, because the executives only wanted to hear takes on the material from BIPOC or female or LGBTQ writers. Some shows even started instituting staffing quotas that 40 to 50% of the writing staff had to be people of color. Here I just want to add in that at that level, you are no longer doing representation, but over-representation. The writer continues, I know many showrunners who hate this, not because they didn't want to hire new writers and foster them, but because they didn't want half their staff coming from a pool of young, inexperienced writers who knew nothing about working in a writer's room, production, post, or deadlines. In other words, their immutable characteristics were just about the only qualification of these younger and newly brought in writers. If you wonder why so many movies and TV series have gone down the drain these past few years, this is why. Skilled and experienced writers weren't welcomed because they were too white and too straight, even if they were gay in some cases. And without them, there was no one in the room to prevent the much younger and inexperienced writers, who also happened to be diverse, from making every beginner's mistake in the book. The whistleblower continues, no institution reinforces this more than the Writers Guild of America. One glance at their monthly calendar of events shows a Latinx Writers Committee meeting, an LGBTQ+ Writers Committee meeting, a Committee of Black Writers meeting, a Middle Eastern Writers Committee meeting, a Women's Writers Committee meeting, and an Asian American Writers Committee meeting, to name just a few. Can you imagine if there was a white Writers Committee meeting? We might be murdered. And the saddest part of all of this is that most of the people who would fill that room are some of the most liberal people I know, people who have gone out of their way to foster new and unique voices. I want to read that bit one more time because there's an important lesson here. This screenwriter says, the saddest part of all of this is that most of the people who would fill that room of white writers are some of the most liberal people I know. No, sad is not the appropriate term here, because there's nothing sad about it. The more appropriate term would be ironic, because what happened here was the inevitable end result of the virtue signaling of these useful idiots. And that's exactly what the writers to whom this whistleblower refers in actuality are and always were, useful idiots. When they thought themselves good liberals, they were in reality being tools, which aided and abetted as their fellow liberals increasingly became more extreme, gradually taking their masks off and revealing themselves to be everything these liberals on paper should oppose with every fiber of their being. Yet, being good collaborators, they helped usher this in. To be clear, I'm not saying these self-described liberal writers were solely responsible, but I am saying they were part of the problem, and it could never have gotten as bad as it is without their participation. More on that later. For now, on with the revelations. Check out the Writers Guild of America's own 2022 Inclusion and Equity Report and make your own conclusion on the Writers Guild's priorities on this. When creating a writer's profile on the WGA website, there is one box to check if you're heterosexual, 3 choices under transgendered, and 6 under LGBTQ. Not sure what those statistics have to do with writing a great episode of The Witcher. This is true. Maybe these writers should get organized against the Writers Guild, because that form indicates the rot runs deep. But how did we get to this? Here, I'd like to add that this writer may not have any insight into what happens at the C-suite level, and so is missing that piece of the puzzle.
Put a chick in it, make her gay!
But from this writer's point of view, the blame for this mess is threefold. Young creative executives with no understanding of the business or what audiences want gained too much influence during the streaming wars. They also took it upon themselves to lead the charge in reinterpreting IP, changing successful comic books, novels, and remakes into projects that had something to say, not to entertain. Why even bother with IP if you don't respect the source material? Indeed, and nearly every IP-based production released since 2019 is the perfect case in point of that. One of the most egregious, though, may be the BBC's Around the World in 80 Days, starring David Tennant. The subversion in that one was off the charts. If you missed it, don't worry, we'll be dropping a lengthy post-mortem/retrospective detailing that in the next few days here. Make sure to check back for that, because it's a hoot. But on with the revelations. According to the whistleblower, this started with young creative executives. The Writers Guild followed their lead and threw a huge part of their own membership under the bus in a race to bring in new members. And lastly, this new class of writers who weren't ready yet to step up to the plate worked on a lot of product that the general public didn't want to see and didn't relate to. What happens next is anyone's guess. The article goes on, and I invite you to head on over to Film Threat to read it in full. Link is in the description. I will tell you what I hope happens though, and that is that all of these liberal writers who aided and abetted in bringing forth this state of affairs in the first place decide to do what this whistleblower did. Namely, stop being part of the problem and become part of the solution. And you don't do that by whispering between yourself, waiting for the problem to resolve itself on its own. It won't. Exposing these Writers Guild documents and how bad things really are is being part of the solution, because that is the first step in fixing the problem. I'm addressing any writers who might be listening directly now. If you truly see yourself as liberal, then it's high time you accept that a big chunk of your industry functionally has become the polar opposite of that. And for all your good intentions, even if it was just through your silence, you did your little part in bringing forth the current state of affairs, which through Hollywood's global influence has contributed to making the world more divided and a worse place to be. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and you are on the wrong side of history. But you don't have to continue to be. I won't pretend to know how to fix this problem, but chances are no one's gonna come in and fix it for you. You're gonna have to do your part. So if some kind of solution emerges or even seems possible, I do hope that everyone adversely affected by the last few years' developments in Hollywood chooses to be part of that solution, even if that means going a little bit against your liberal beliefs. Just remember that those liberal beliefs are what got us here. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.